Just 5 minutes ago, confirmation emerged that King Charles and Prince William took the rare and dramatic step of stripping royal privileges, a move so serious and immediately raised questions about what had been uncovered behind closed doors. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was not a temporary pause. Royal privileges are not removed lightly, and certainly not without agreement between the monarch and the heir. The fact that both acted together speaks volumes about the gravity of what was discovered. Those familiar with palace protocol know that late-night decisions are often the most severe. They are made when evidence can no longer be ignored and delay becomes more damaging than action. Whatever surfaced was compelling enough to override caution, tradition, and potential fallout. Sources suggest the discovery was not new information, but rather confirmation of something long suspected, something that crossed a line once proof was undeniable. In that moment, loyalty gave way to responsibility, and protection gave way to consequence. The shock did not come from the action itself, but from its timing. Taken under the cover of night, without public preparation, the decision signals urgency and finality. One truth is already clear. This was not about image. This was about control, accountability, and preserving the future of the monarchy. And once privileges are stripped, there is no quiet way back. The discovery did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived quietly, carried through private channels, verified line by line, and weighed with the kind of caution only the palace understands. By the time King Charles was informed, there was no confusion, only a growing realization that something long contained had finally crossed into a dangerous space. Late-night discoveries are never accidental. They are the result of information that has been building, often dismissed as rumor or speculation until evidence removes all doubt. This time, the confirmation came in a form that could not be explained away. Documents, communications, and timelines aligned too precisely to ignore. For King Charles, the weight of the moment was deeply personal. As monarch, he is expected to uphold the integrity of the crown. As a father, he is instinctively protective. That night, those two responsibilities collided. The information placed before him did not allow for delay, negotiation, or emotional buffering. Prince William was brought in immediately, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The heir's involvement signaled that the issue was not temporary or containable. It was something that could affect the monarchy's future if left unresolved. Their conversation was direct, stripped of emotion, and focused on consequence. What made the discovery so alarming was not just its content, but its implications. It suggested a misuse of royal association, privileges extended in trust, now potentially weaponized in ways that endangered the institution's credibility. This was not about private behavior. It was about actions that risked public trust. The palace has endured scandals before, but this moment felt different. There was a sense that previous restraint had allowed the situation to escalate. The evidence now suggested that silence had become complicity. That realization alone demanded action. King Charles understood that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. In an era where transparency is demanded and patience is thin, protecting the crown required decisiveness. The monarchy cannot appear unsure when its authority is challenged internally. Prince William's response was measured but firm. As someone who has spent years preparing for future responsibility, he recognized that leadership is often defined by the most uncomfortable decisions. His concern was not only about the present fallout, but about precedent. Allowing royal privileges to remain untouched would signal tolerance. The decision to strip privileges was discussed carefully, but not endlessly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Instead, there was an acknowledgement that the situation had reached a point of no return. Once trust is breached at this level, restoration becomes nearly impossible. What makes such decisions especially painful is their permanence. Royal privileges are not symbolic favors. They are extensions of authority, access, and legitimacy. Removing them redraws boundaries permanently. It sends a message not just internally, but to the world. The late hour played a crucial role. Night decisions carry urgency. They are made when delay poses greater risk than action. The palace understands that by morning, speculation would begin. Acting before dawn allowed control of the narrative, and more importantly, control of the damage. There was also an emotional undercurrent rarely discussed publicly. King Charles is not a ruler detached from feeling. He is acutely aware of how history judges moments like these. He knows that protecting the institution sometimes requires personal sacrifice, and that sacrifice often involves relationships. Prince William's presence reinforced unity. This was not a divided leadership acting independently. It was a coordinated decision, signaling continuity and shared responsibility. That unity matters deeply to the stability of the monarchy. Once the decision was finalized, instructions were issued quietly. Access was adjusted. Entitlements were reviewed. Titles were not publicly addressed, but privileges tied to representation and authority were immediately withdrawn. The process was methodical, precise, and irreversible. No announcement followed. Silence was intentional. The palace understood that premature disclosure would invite chaos. Instead, they allowed the decision to exist internally first, absorbing its consequences before presenting it outwardly. Those closest to the situation sensed the shift immediately. The atmosphere changed. Familiar routines were altered. The invisible lines that define royal hierarchy were redrawn overnight. This discovery forced the monarchy to confront a truth it had long avoided. Tradition cannot protect against misconduct, and lineage cannot excuse accountability. In that recognition, a new boundary was set. What began as a late-night briefing ended as one of the most decisive internal actions taken in years. And by the time dawn approached, the monarchy was no longer operating under the same assumptions it had the night before. The removal of royal privileges was carried out without ceremony, but its impact was immediate. Within the palace, the absence was felt before it was discussed. Access points changed. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. Established routines that had existed for years were altered in a single night. Those closest to the inner workings of the household understood that this was not temporary. What made the decision especially striking was its scope. The privileges removed were not symbolic or cosmetic. They involved representation, authority, and proximity to the crown, the very elements that define relevance within the royal structure. Once these were gone, the individual in question was effectively repositioned outside the core framework of influence. Names were not spoken openly. The palace rarely confirmed such matters directly, preferring implication over declaration. Yet, internally, there was no confusion. Everyone understood who had been affected and why. The clarity came not from announcement, but from the precision of the actions taken. Family reactions varied, but silence dominated. Shock does not always present itself loudly. In this case, it manifested as restraint. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact lingered longer. The emotional weight settled into the spaces between words. Some family members struggled privately with the finality of the decision. Royal life is built on continuity, and removing privileges disrupts that flow. Even those who supported the decision recognized its personal cost. This was not punishment for the sake of optics. It was a boundary drawn to protect the institution. King Charles maintained composure throughout. His demeanor reflected resolve rather than anger. The absence of visible emotion was intentional. Leadership at this level requires steadiness, especially when decisions invite scrutiny and misunderstanding. Prince William's response was quieter, but no less firm. He understood that empathy cannot replace accountability. While deeply aware of the human impact, he remained focused on the long-term implications. His concern extended beyond the present moment, toward how the monarchy would be perceived if it failed to act decisively. The palace staff adapted quickly. They are trained for transitions, even those born of discomfort. Adjustments were made discreetly, avoiding unnecessary exposure. This professionalism helped contain the emotional ripple effects, but it did not erase them. What unsettled many was the realization that this decision had been discussed for some time. The late-night discovery did not create the issue, it confirmed it. That distinction mattered. It meant that patience had already been extended. Boundaries had already been tested and restraint had already been exercised. The silence that followed was not avoidance. It was processing. The royal family understands that moments of consequence require space. Immediate reaction often distorts clarity. By allowing silence to exist, they preserved control over both emotion and narrative. Behind closed doors, conversations focused on recalibration. How would roles shift? How would responsibilities be redistributed? The monarchy is an ecosystem, and removing one element affects the balance. These questions were addressed carefully, without haste. The absence of public explanation intensified speculation, but that was expected. The palace has long accepted that silence invites conjecture. However, it also understands that premature disclosure can deepen damage. Choosing silence was a calculated risk. What mattered most internally was alignment. There were no visible fractures between King Charles and Prince William. Their shared stance reinforced stability. In times of uncertainty, unity at the top reassures those below. The emotional toll was undeniable. Even when decisions are necessary, they are rarely painless. The family felt the weight of consequence not as a single moment, but as an ongoing presence. As hours turned into days, the reality of the change settled in. Privileges once taken for granted were no longer available. Doors once open were now closed. This shift redefined boundaries in a way that could not be undone quietly. The palace fell into a new rhythm, slower, more cautious, more introspective. This was not collapse. It was recalibration. The monarchy was adjusting to a reality shaped by accountability rather than tradition alone. In that silence, one truth became clear: royal privilege is not unconditional. And when trust is compromised, consequence follows. Regardless of lineage. This understanding marked a turning point within the palace, one that would influence decisions long after public attention moved on. The effects of the decision did not remain confined within palace walls. Even without official confirmation, the shift was felt outwardly, almost immediately. Subtle changes began to register: altered appearances, adjusted schedules, and a noticeable absence from spaces once routinely occupied. To those familiar with royal patterns, the message was unmistakable. Public perception is shaped as much by what is missing as by what is shown. In this case, absence spoke loudly. Observers began to question why certain figures were no longer visible, why representation had narrowed, and why responsibility appeared more concentrated around King Charles and Prince William. The monarchy's center of gravity was clearly tightening. Internally, the redistribution of influence was swift. Responsibilities that had previously been shared or delegated were quietly reassigned. Advisors recalibrated reporting lines. Decision-making channels became more direct, reducing ambiguity. This consolidation was not about dominance, but about stability. In moments of uncertainty, clarity becomes essential. Prince William's role grew more pronounced during this period. While always visible as heir, he now operated with increased authority behind the scenes. His involvement in strategic discussions deepened, signaling a deliberate preparation for future leadership. This was not symbolic mentoring. It was active engagement shaped by necessity. King Charles, meanwhile, adopted a more guarded posture. His public presence remained measured, but privately he focused on reinforcing institutional discipline. The decision to strip privileges had drawn a clear boundary, and he was determined that boundary would hold. For him, this was not merely corrective action. It was a statement of values. The monarchy's future direction began to take shape through these choices. There was a noticeable emphasis on responsibility over personality, duty over visibility. This shift aligned with broader public expectations, where credibility increasingly depends on accountability rather than tradition alone. Within the family, the emotional complexity continued to unfold. Some members felt relief that a long-standing tension had been resolved. Others mourned the loss of familiarity and trust. These reactions were not contradictory. They coexisted. The royal family, like any other, experiences change as both necessity and loss. The power balance adjustment also altered how advisors approached risk. Previously tolerated ambiguities were no longer acceptable. Scrutiny increased, assumptions were challenged. This recalibration reflected a recognition that modern monarchy operates under constant observation, where mistakes are amplified and silence is interpreted. Media speculation intensified, but the palace remained unmoved. There were no clarifications, no defensive gestures. This restraint was deliberate. By refusing to engage, the monarchy reinforced the seriousness of its actions. Silence, in this context, conveyed resolve rather than avoidance. The public, accustomed to dramatic responses, found this approach unsettling. Yet over time, the lack of reaction became its own reassurance. It suggested that the institution was not reacting impulsively, but acting with long-term intention. This moment also prompted broader reflection about royal privilege itself. The idea that privilege could be withdrawn decisively and without public spectacle challenged long-held assumptions. It signaled that status within the monarchy is contingent upon conduct, not non-event. Prince William's influence in shaping this message was evident. His understanding of contemporary expectations helped frame the decision as forward-looking rather than punitive. He recognized that the monarchy's relevance depends on its willingness to evolve. The internal power shift did not create instability. Instead, it produced cohesion. By aligning authority more closely with responsibility, the monarchy strengthened its foundation. This alignment reassured both staff and supporters that leadership remained focused and unified. Emotionally, the family continued to navigate the aftermath quietly. There were moments of reflection, reassessment, and adjustment. Relationships were redefined. Expectations were reset. This process was gradual, unfolding without public markers. The future of the monarchy now appeared more streamlined. Roles were clearer. Boundaries were firmer. The institution had absorbed a shock and emerged more disciplined. This outcome did not erase the pain of the decision, but it affirmed its necessity. History often judges moments like these, not by their immediate impact, but by their lasting influence. In this case, the influence lay in the precedent set. The monarchy demonstrated that it could enforce accountability internally, without external pressure. As days passed, the narrative began to settle. Speculation continued, but certainty replaced confusion. The monarchy had acted, and it would not reverse course quietly. This decision reshaped not only who held privilege, but how privilege itself was understood. And in doing so, it quietly redefined the future of the crown. After the decision was made and the immediate adjustments settled into place, the palace entered a period of quiet reckoning. This was the stage no briefing could prepare for. The emotional aftermath that follows decisive action. While authority had been asserted and boundaries reinforced, the human cost lingered in ways that could not be managed by protocol alone. For King Charles, the weight of the moment deepened rather than lifted. Leadership often appears strongest at the moment of decision, but its true burden emerges afterward. He understood that history would likely frame this as a necessary act of preservation. Yet privately, it remained a deeply personal reckoning. The balance between duty and family had once again demanded sacrifice. Prince William felt the consequences differently. As someone positioned between generations, he carried both responsibility and anticipation. This moment marked a shift not only in power, but in expectation. It was a preview of the leadership challenges that would define his future. The clarity he showed during the decision now translated into reflection about the kind of monarch he intended to become. Within the family, relationships subtly recalibrated. Some bonds strengthened through shared resolve, while others grew distant, shaped by unspoken understanding rather than conflict. There were no dramatic confrontations, no visible fractures. Instead, there was acceptance, quiet, restrained, and heavy with implication. The emotional atmosphere inside the palace softened over time, but it did not return to what it had been. Moments of normalcy reappeared, yet carried a new awareness. Laughter was gentler. Conversations were more deliberate. The experience had altered the emotional landscape permanently. Staff members, often overlooked in public narratives, absorbed the change with professionalism. They understood that history unfolds not only through public announcements, but through internal discipline. Their ability to adapt without commentary helped stabilize the household during a sensitive transition. Publicly, the monarchy maintained composure. There were no visible acknowledgments of strain, no gestures inviting sympathy. This restraint was intentional. The institution has long understood that its strength lies not in emotional display, but in continuity. Still, those who watched closely sensed the gravity beneath the surface. Over time, the decision began to be understood not as an isolated act, but as part of a broader evolution. The monarchy was signaling that it would no longer rely solely on tradition to justify authority. Accountability had become a defining principle, even when its application was painful. This moment will likely be referenced quietly in future years, not named directly, but understood contextually. It will serve as an internal benchmark, a reminder of where lines were drawn and why. Such moments shape institutional memory more powerfully than public ceremonies ever could. For King Charles, this decision will stand as one of the most defining of his reign, not because it drew attention, but because it demanded resolve. He demonstrated that leadership does not always seek approval, and that preservation sometimes requires discomfort. Prince William's role will still be remembered. His alignment with the decision reinforced the monarchy's continuity. It showed that future leadership would not retreat from difficult choices, even when they carried personal consequence.